There was some discussion on IRC on which console is better for homebrew, whether it's the Nintendo DS or the PSP, and to tell you the truth, I think it's just retarded, like, arguing about it, because every single console has its own benefits and drawbacks to homebrew. In front of me I have a smorgasbord of Game Boy Color, Game Boy Classic, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Pocket, and Game Boy Advance, Game Boy SP, and hopefully I'll get into some Nintendo DS later on, but for now I want to focus on some of the more classic hardware, and maybe get into some of the newer stuff. I'll give you a quick crash course on the flash cartridges, starting with the Game Boy Color series, which is over here. This is a 64 megabit flash cartridge. If you're familiar with episode 5 of Wargrabbing, I was actually able to put some homebrew code on here to use to transmit and receive infrared from my Game Boy Color. The Game Boy Color does in fact have an infrared port. You can do some fun stuff with that. The Game Boys also have serial ports, so it's really good if you actually know how to code. You can actually use your Game Boy Pocket, Game Boy Color, or Game Boy Classic, or even your Game Boy Advance for microcontroller design, or a serial terminal, or a serial screen. There's a whole bunch of great stuff you can do. Now, to get code onto this cartridge, you need a programmer, and this over here is called the Game Boy Game Jack, or the GB Game Jack. The chances of you getting your hands on this dev kit are slim to none. The pluses are it works right out of the box. I can actually put an original game here and the cartridge in here and actually copy a game. Not condoning piracy, not condoning even backing up your own original games, but you know, this I use for development purposes. All of this is for dev purposes, not for pirating games. So if you have piracy intents, I really don't care. I don't judge. Just don't ask me how to do it. Now, the pros, it works out of the box. It's very simple to use. The cons, it will not work with Mac OS, it will not work with Linux, it will not work with Windows NT, it will not work with XP. It works under a DOS environment and the tools are poorly translated. Even getting the tools to run on a current operating system is a very difficult job. Even running on Windows 95 or Windows ME, you're going to have a hard time. Now you can go ahead and build your own programmer. I'll put some links in the show notes about building your own cartridges and your own programmer, but it's not for the faint of heart. In a little while I'll do a top-down view of some cartridges and how to modify them for your own development purposes. But if you're really into this, go to the show notes. I'll give you a lot more URLs and links to how to make your own programmer and dev carts, but save that for later. Game Boy Advance. These are two Flash 2 Advance 256 megabit Game Boy Advance cartridges. This will actually boot Game Boy Advance code. You can put it in your Game Boy Advance and put Game Boy Advance code on it. Whoop-de-freaking-do. The way you program them is you put them in your Game Boy SP or your Advance, and when you hold start and select when you boot the system up, it goes into what we call multi-boot mode. And what that allows you to do is, using a third-party device via the serial port, load 640K of code into the memory and execute it. So using your computer's USB or printer port, you'll actually put a bootloader and transfer utility on the Game Boy, so you can actually program your cartridges through the Game Boy. There are other cartridges that go up to 1 gigabit, but I'm a big fan of the Flash 2 Advance. Mainly because they actually have this thing called the Flash 2 Advance Game Bridge. This allows me to put Game Boy Classic code on this cartridge, and using this device, boot it in a classic hardware or in a Game Boy Advance in classic mode. So you don't have to go and find a game jack. You don't have to go and build a program. You don't have to build a dev cart. You can actually go and spend the extra $20, $30 on the Game Bridge and have the backwards compatibility. So now this one cartridge, I mean, you can put so much code onto this cartridge. You can, if you actually did pirate games, you could probably put anywhere from 64 to 128 or more games on this cartridge, maybe up to 512 games, depending on how big. 256 is a fair size. I didn't feel I needed to go any higher. Like I said, they do go up to 1 gigabit. And I would suggest going and getting the Game Bridge and a Flash 2 Advance if you're going to go and do Game Boy Advance and Game Boy Color. Not only that, but if you have a passkey, which I'll get into the Nintendo DS stuff later on, you can still boot code on your Nintendo DS with this very cartridge. So this will work for the Nintendo DS, it'll work for your Game Boy Advance, and it'll work for your Game Boy Classic. I see no reason why not to get one of these cards. There are better cards, but we'll get into that later. Let's go into a top-down. I'll showcase some of the fun stuff you can do with a Game Boy Color, and what you can do some fun stuff in Game Boy Classic mode on your Game Boy SP. I just want to cover real quick these 3 circuit boards I have laid out. These are 3 different Game Boy Classic games. I don't know what they are. I don't care. These two are called MBC1. They basically have some ROM and a little bit of space for save games. This is an MBC3. This actually has your ROM, some SRAM, and a real-time clock, the whole shebang. If you actually want to make your own homebrew cartridge, what you do is you go online, or I'll give some show notes, and you find out what is the maximum amount of code space that your MBC controller can handle, and what kind of specifications the memory requires. So then you basically pull off this chip, and then you solder in the replacement. It's not going to be pin for pin, but nonetheless, it will work. You put it back inside your cartridge, you program, you put it in your cartridge, you program, you put it in your Game Boy, it'll work just fine. But like I said earlier, you might as well just getting a flash cart and a game bridge. Get Game Boy Advance mode, Nintendo DS if you've got one with a pass key, and it'll be backwards compatible with your Game Boy Classic. You'll have to forgive me, I wanted to actually showcase the Game Boy Color and Game Boy Classic stuff on a classic hardware, but because of the glare in the room, I can't get a good screenshot. Let's zoom into my, my Game Boy SP screen, and I'll show you this fun little utility that I'm running. If you can see this properly, this program's called Freakboy. Its main job is a phone freaking application. When I wasn't kidding that many of China has feared my pink Game Boy, this is why. It's a tone generating application, which I'll showcase in a minute. It does red box tones, blue box tones, DTMF tone dialer, and I mean that's it right there. I mean, phone freaking on your Game Boy. I'll actually show you how to use the tone dialer in just a minute. I want to show you a couple of other applications though. Here's a fun little application. It's called GB Remote, I believe. What it does is using your Game Boy Advance, not your Game Boy Color, using your Game Boy Color, not your Game Boy Advance, because Game Boy Color has the infrared port, it'll actually record, store, and play back infrared signals. So you can actually use this as your Game Boy as a universal infrared remote control. Very useful for wargamming. Here's another useful little application. This is the Game Boy PDA. If you notice, it's got a phone dialer, it's got a memo book, it's got a calculator, it's got a date book, it's got a world map, it has a little memo pad. I mean, hell, if you got a flash cart, this thing only takes up maybe 256K of code space. Why not slap it on here? So you put on your bootloader, you put on your Freakboy, you put on your remote control software. This also has remote control software built in. So now your Game Boy Color is a PDA, a remote control, and a tone dialing phone freaking application. Okay, so far this is actually starting to get pretty interesting, if you ask me. Here is one of my more favorite scanning utilities for infrared called Infrared Investigator for the Game Boy Color. It does just quite that. It can actually scan, receive, record, edit, and store infrared signals. So you can actually go to a location, grab some infrared signals, bring them home to your PC using a special cable that you make, dump them, or if you have your dump the SRAM from your cartridge, pull off the data, and actually look at, investigate, and fiddle around with infrared signals. Another one of those really nifty-difty, handy-dandy infrared applications. If you have an RCX robot motor controller, commonly known for the LEGO Mindstorms robotic kit, you can actually now use the infrared coming out of your Game Boy Color to control your robot. I do believe some other toys use the RCX protocol. I think the Aibo might use it, and the Roomba. I'm not sure, but hell, now your Game Boy Color is a PDA, a phone freaking application, an infrared remote controller, an infrared investigator, and now you can go and use it to control robots. So, why not do this? I don't know. Alright, we're back at the project table. Here's my home phone. Here's my Game Boy SP, loaded up with Freakboy. There it is, just like I showed before. I've programmed it in, so it'll actually dial a local test number. Here you go. Get your DTMF decoders ready. Okay. Just to show you that there's no smoke and mirrors, there's no kind of camera tricks here. I'm going to show you Freakboy in action.
98.
There you go. Just to prove, no tricks, no smokes, no mirrors. I'll do it again. And dial 1718-336-9901 if you haven't picked that up on your tone dialer, on your DTMF decoders.
Greetings. You have reached Avenue R DSO. Serving codes 336, 339, 375, 376, 382, 627.
Alright, shut up. Alright, the reason I use my Game Boy SP is mainly for screen reasons. I've got way too much glare on the Game Boy Color. Also, the sound processor inside the Game Boy Advance SP has to be one of the better ones, besides the original Game Boy model, the one that was made in 1989. So if you want to use a phone freaking application, use an Advance, preferably an SP. So to recap everything that I've stated here, if you're going to get into Game Boy development, I'd highly suggest getting a flash card, a Game Boy Advance flash card, and a Game Bridge. That way you're backwards compatible with Game Boy Color and Game Boy Mono, Game Boy Classic, and you can still load Game Boy Advance code, and later on you can actually use something called a Pass-Me on the Nintendo DS to go and load code onto these cartridges. That wraps up for this one. In the next one, I'll go and try to cover some Game Boy Advanced specific stuff, and hopefully the one after that I'll do Nintendo DS. It depends on if you guys actually want to see it or not. Alright, so that's that. Check the show notes. I'll try to have some links on and some information about all of this fun stuff.